Yeah, so last time we ended off talking about the civil rights movement at that time. And so let's go ahead and look at somebody else who had something to do with that. Somebody we talked a little bit about before, Booker T. Washington. So remember, I had you read a little bit his famous speech at that agricultural convention in Georgia, where he called for people to kind of live with one another, right? And to turn the other cheek. And by showing kindness, overcoming racism, right? So, born a slave and then worked as a coal miner as a young man, he put himself through college and went on to found the Tuskegee University of 1881. Called for African Americans to pull themselves up through hard work and to show that racism was wrong by living out a good example. So, by living out a good example, one thing he pointed out when he was a young man, he saw the difficulties it had for people who had lived generations as slaves, all of a sudden having freedom and cash and stuff like that, and they didn't understand like long-term consequences of spending all your money at once and stuff like that, right? So, or dangers of alcoholism and things like that. He like, have you ever watched Shark Tank?
Nope.
The show?
Shark Tank? Oh yes, I have.
Where they bring like their products in and then like
Yeah.
they're the ones that they get like all the essence and they can
Yeah.
put their product online. Well, I mean they already had it online, but they like more people know about it.
Yeah, so he was kind of like, hey guys and gals, hey. Yeah, so he's right. So like Booker T. Washington did that for his university and also for other things that had to do with like black rights. He would go to like really big business people such as like Carnegie and other millionaires, and he would make a case of why they should donate to his organizations, right, charitably. And he understood that if I'm going to go to a business person, I have to think like a business person. So he would crunch the numbers. So he would know all the facts about whatever he's trying to do, like his university. And so when they ask him questions, he's already able to answer those questions. Like, here's how many students I have. Here's how much money I need for this project, this project. This is what it's going to do. So he's very, very brilliant in that aspect. And so if you ever find yourself like where you're grant writing for like college or something like that, you want some free money to go to school, it's a good idea to make sure whatever you're writing that grant for, it's going to be viewed by a board. You want to make sure that you're writing something that that board wants to hear. So if you wanted like a grant for agriculture, right? A couple years ago, I heard a guy who was in charge of a big agriculture grant for different colleges. And so one thing he complained about is whenever kids would write for these grants, they would, I say kids, they're like 18, 19, 20. Yeah. So one second. So whenever they'd write for these grants, they would write as if they were texting, right? They're writing for college money, but they're like putting like LOL and stuff like that, So yeah, people would do this. And so like, they're shuffling through it. So make sure if you're going up to a professional person wanting something, be professional, right? The T doesn't mean anything. His middle name it's just the letter T. When he was a slave, he didn't have a last name. And so his family and himself got to pick last name, middle name. He just picked he was a little boy and he picked the letter T because he thought it sounded cool to be called Booker T. So it's just... all right, so moving on from that, we have muckrakers. We talked about them before. That was one of your vocabulary terms at the beginning of the unit. So these are journalists and authors who called for reform in the progressive movement at that time for both social things and governmental things. So social things. So the big social thing at this time was had to do with legislative measures on alcohol, work conditions, women's right to vote. Governmental things meant like ending corruption and perhaps making more legislation to hopefully improve people's lives. You can be the judge of that. All right, so though often sensationalist, so sensationalism means you are like trying to reach people's emotions. You're making clickbait. you're kind of telling the truth, but you're making it sound crazy so people will buy it. They brought attention to the poor working conditions, municipal, that city mismanagement. So like, child labor, education problems, and inequality of wealth. So that's usually a problem. I mean, if the poor are getting poorer, then that means their quality of life is going down. Money is factually tied with a higher propensity for things like alcoholism, suicide, abuse, violent crime, all that stuff. It's not that it causes it, but it can make it more likely. It's a correlation, So people realized this at the time. You go to a poor neighborhood back then, you'd see more crime. Kind of like today. That can often be the case. Yeah, I mean, it's not always like that. I mean, it's not always like that, but it's like, if you're in the poorer part of a major city, it's probably going to have more crime.
Did you get a haircut?
Like a week ago. Looks, yeah, my wife hooked me up. Like, it's hard to find time because kids got stuff, and it seemed like we had like 2 appliances break down at the same time, and now I got to figure out how to fix them. Both our washing machine and our dishwasher. So that's like panic mode. Like, we got to get that done. All right. Or we're going to be dirty and eat off dirty stuff. All right. Next one. Hey, what's this?
Oh, wow. It's an octopus.
It's an octopus. What's it say right here?
It says standard. That's so words.
Yeah. Yeah.
I can't.
Letters make words. You break your glasses. Standard Oil, yeah. Standard Oil was a monopoly that controlled almost all the oil production in the United States. They got to pick prices and control a bunch of things. And you see the artist made its tentacles go around Capitol Hill, Congress, and it's reaching towards the White House. And it's got these business people all wrapped up. And so it's just like controlling everything, this big monster. I kind of like his back arch there. It's like, no!
That's how the Bible is.
All right, so once again, a time for reform. During this time period, we're going to talk about these parties more. You're going to see third parties crop up. Now, in American history, third parties are never successful in like gaining the presidency. But third parties are good at doing things like their issues will eventually become national issues. And sometimes they go through. But another thing, too, is sometimes a third party will steal votes from one of the 2 major parties so that the party that would have lost gets to win. We're going to see that a couple of times. So like the Populist Party, this is the one I told you is mostly made up of farmers. And like populism is just another word for like popular democracy. It's just like the little guy, right? So largely made up of farmers in the South and the West in the 1890s. Called for silver-based money supply. They believe, remember farmers at this time, they were losing their farms to foreclosures by the banks. And they're like, well, the banks are controlling all the gold supply. So they saw gold as a major problem. And so they thought that if they could change it to silver, since there's more silver in supply, silver-based cash would mean that they'd have more cash on hand. And somehow that would mean that they'd have more money to spend. In reality, I don't think it quite works that way, but it was a big argument at the time. So they also wanted things that at the time was very unheard of in America, but you could find examples of in Europe. Because you remember, before this time, and especially before the Civil War, all the government really ever done was run the post office and the military. That was about it, the federal government. But they're calling for an expansion of it. They're calling for the government to provide storehouses to put their crops and grains so they can sell them whenever the market's looking better. So they're like, look, we're losing things when the price to their goods was getting lower because everyone's getting better at growing it. So they were hoping for better times. That, and if you could store it, at least it would be safer. They were also calling for the government to take over the railroads. A lot of this had to do with the choo-choo train companies. The railroad companies had these things called vouchers, right? And so their friends would get vouchers so that they would have reduced cost on shipping things. But that only went to big companies. So small farmers would have to pay the full price and lose out on profits. They thought this was unfair. And they thought the best way to do that, to overcome that, let's just have the government take over it. The part of the argument was that the government essentially gave the railroads for free all of that land, so they had the right to take it. See, they're going to have their major candidate, William Jennings Bryan, is going to begin as a populist, and he's eventually going to become a Democrat presidential candidate. But he will serve in the federal government under Woodrow Wilson later. We'll see, up until World War I. But yeah, he's going to represent a lot of the Southern movement of he's an evangelical preacher. He's also I think he is. And he's also a very well-spoken man, trained attorney. He's going to be very motivating for a lot of people, right? And so he's going to call for a lot of things like nonviolence and stuff like that too. Another third party is the Progressive Party, the Bull Moose Party. We're going to talk about that a bit later after we talk about Teddy Roosevelt, because really it's just the Teddy Roosevelt Party. It's going to start as a movement for general reform in America. So we've been talking about the progressive movement. It's going to become a Democrat and a Republican thing. Both sides are going to take this up. However, it's going to become a full-fledged party with a presidential candidate when Teddy Roosevelt wants to have a third term. It's not going to work out, but we'll see later. It's going to call for workers' rights and ending corruption in government and business. Now, yeah. But that's because we're going to have a constitutional amendment after Teddy Roosevelt's cousin, FDR, is going to be president a few times. And they're going to be like, well, we don't want to do that again. So they're going to make an amendment just like George Washington. So,
What was the longest term for?
it was FDR's. I don't remember the years, but it was like, it was through most of the Great Depression and almost all of World War II. So he's around. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was around a long time.
So
From March 4th, 1933 to April 12th, 1945.
Yeah, see? Okay. Yeah, like I'm the worst about dates. If you have noticed, I'm not very hard. When you're taking your test, I'm not very hard about making sure you know hard dates. I'm pretty bad about it myself. The thing is, that's not necessarily history. Years and dates aren't history. It's trivia, right? That's like Jeopardy stuff. But, if you got it, you got it. Then you're better than me. You ready to move on?
Yes.
All right. Hey, don't forget, this stuff is up on Google Classroom in case you miss a day. And you also go in and see the lectures too. I've already had students tell me to study for their other tests, my other classes, that they've gone back over the lectures, over the notes and stuff like that to make sure they're ready. So I hope they are, because they already took the test. Hey, what's this? Teddy Roosevelt. Yeah, what's he doing?
He's driving boats.
Yeah, he's dragging boats. Those aren't just any boats. Those are gunboats.
Is that Puerto Rico?
Santo Domingo, Mexico, Panama. No. Yeah, I think it's kind of like mushed up. Like there's Venezuela. I think it's mushed up. The Caribbean, Mexico. Like, see, you got Cuba there.
Wait, where are you guys reading this?
I thought the
You forgot what you thought? What? Yeah, they're off over here on their own islands. I think the artist just did this to kind of make so it fit.
They are in the Caribbean, right?
Yeah, they are. You're right.
Mexico?
Well, Mexico is in the Gulf. I mean, like connected to the Gulf of Mexico, which is connected to it. I don't know. Like the artist just did this. Like what he's doing here.
He's wrong.
I know. Like factually, geographically, he's wrong, but it's a political cartoon to make a point. So Teddy Roosevelt our first really progressive president is going to be somebody who's also going to make sure that America starts entering the international scene. And so this is kind of critical of him. So it's kind of like making him look like a guy who's basically playing around with toys, not taking it seriously. So he was often criticized for this, but he's also championed for it as well. So this is the start of another unit, essentially. So you don't need to have the date here, but just know we're calling it U.S. Emergence as a World Power. So before this, Americans had generally stuck to George Washington's plea for us to avoid all entangling alliances with foreigners. So because by making strong alliances with our friends overseas, we could get dragged into wars, was the argument. And he figured it would be better to just trade with everyone at least as neutral powers instead of getting involved in war. But we're going to see under Teddy Roosevelt, we're going to enter something called the Spanish-American War. And with that, we're going to start moving into where we start expanding overseas. Now, you can make the case that America's already done this with the Mexican-American War. That's a pretty valid argument. But we're going to talk about that after Christmas because, after Christmas, because remember, we're going back in time. We're going to do early America then. But yeah, in that war, we had a war with Mexico, and it was an expansionist war. I mean, because we got land at the end. So, I mean, that's pretty self-evident.
The war was for Texas.
Yeah, it was justified over Texas because you had Mexican and American troops fighting along the border. Because Mexico was like, you can't have Texas because Santa Anna was a jerk, and he signed that treaty when he was a prisoner, and we don't recognize it anyways. And Texas and America was like, yeah, but he was your ruler, and he did sign it. And we had a war over it. So then they had another war, and America won it. And then America paid millions of dollars to try to make it go over easier. So, all right. So this is, why did I pick Woodrow Wilson? I don't know. This is an address that President Woodrow Wilson's making to Congress. I'm not sure why I picked this picture, but we got some more vocabulary. Now, here's the thing about vocabulary. If you know what a term means, write it. Don't write it down. If you don't know what it means, make your definition short. You can even make it one word in some cases. I think you can. One word. If you use your imagination, right?
More words.
But if you know what it means, don't write down.
Expansionism.
Yeah, expansionism, the practice of a nation state growing and annexing new territory. What's annexation? Well, it's at the bottom. So this is where a country takes on more land. Kind of like when America was moving out west with Manifest Destiny. That was expansion. Elijah, you okay? I can tell. I'm pretty tired too. My allergies are killing me. Foreign policy, how a nation's actions relate to its relationship to other nations. This is how nations deal with each other, all right? That's foreign policy. Kind of like our foreign policy is different between nations. Our foreign policy with North Korea is very different than our foreign policy with Canada, right? Yeah. Domestic policy. This is how we deal with ourselves, the actions of a nation in response to its own local issues. So you might have domestic policy with like terrorism, domestic policy within interstate trade, race relations, stuff like that, right? And it kind of depends because the federal government has some authority, but not other authorities. So then you have to go to the state or the local place. Diplomacy, the negotiations or engagements held between nations. So it's kind of like foreign policy, but when they're talking. Isolationism, when a nation desires to stay free from strong relationships with foreign nations. You can have different forms of isolationism. You can have like economic isolationism, where you refuse to trade with other countries. You can have diplomatic isolationism, where you're trying not to make treaties with other countries. You're like, hey, leave us alone. Annexation, when a nation takes in new territory. So like when we were talking about Texas, when Texas was annexed. We're going to see under this, we're going to annex Hawaii and Alaska. And we're going to take in territories, places like Puerto Rico and Philippines, but we're not going to make them into states. And we still have not to this day. But of course, Philippines, we relinquished all control of it. So they're completely independent now.
Wait, so
Well,
the Philippines was a part of the U.S.?
no, it was a protectorate. That means they were their own country, kinda. But we had a military there, and we strongly suggested and told them what to do a lot. Had a lot of fighting down there, as a matter of fact. So a lot of U.S. soldiers died trying to hold on to the Philippines. Now they're our friends, right? They're our allies. Like we were like, hey, okay, we're moving out. We're leaving you alone. But they're our allies now, especially after we had to remove the Japanese out during World War II, because the Japanese were just horrible to the Philippine people, like horrible, like murder movie horrible. So yeah, World War II, man. Ugh, I'm gonna talk about some horrible stuff. The what?
World War II Japan. It was like
Oh yeah.
China too. It was-
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. I'm gonna talk about that. Yeah, like the rape of Nanjing and all that other stuff. It's like, whew, rough. Or what is it? Unit 173, where they would do experiments on Chinese
the
people.
entire-
It was terrible. It was terrible. It was just as bad, in some cases worse than what the Nazis did. So we'll talk about that a little bit.
The Russian sleep experiment, was it that World War II?
Oh, I don't know.
You don't know the Russian?
No.
They put a bunch of U.S. soldiers into a chamber, and then they filled it up with gas to keep the soldiers awake, because they wanted to see if they could figure out a way to keep their soldiers awake
Huh.
without them going crazy. And then the people in the chamber, whenever they were finally enough to be released,
Yeah.
they turned off the gas, and the people went crazy.
Well, yeah. When you're staying awake for a long time, yeah, they've shown that people can enter a state of psychosis that they can't break out of. Like they're just like bonkers for life, or they're super scarred, different personality. It's rough. No, I mean,
There was one that was screaming the whole time, and then whenever he went quiet, they looked at one of the portholes that they had in there, and they saw that he was still his mouth was still open, but he had torn his vocal cords because he was screaming nonstop.
ow. Well, let's try to get some sleep tonight, huh? All right. No, I haven't read about that. I mean, I read the Gulag Archipelago not that long ago, and yeah, the Russians were very, very nasty to themselves too. So, but that's communism for you. Well, there's been in the United States, there's been cases of people who've stayed awake for say days and days and days, and then they just snap. Just go crazy.
Something in their brains.
You have to have sleep because it does a lot to, I don't know, kind of cleanse out a lot of the hormonal waste and stuff like that. All right.
They also say that if you don't get enough sleep, it raises your. No.
Well, yeah.
You can
Cortisol,
get
like your stress,
You can get high blood pressure, and then you can also have a higher
you get
chance
sick
of
easier.
getting a heart attack.
Yeah, heart attack, stress, sick easier, you age faster.
They have to be for about 30 days.
That was Americans?
Yeah,
They did it?
It was the Soviet Union.
It couldn't have been during World War II. They were our allies.
Yeah, this is in the late 1940s, a Soviet test facility.
Yeah, that was post World War. That was right after World War II. Then, yeah. This war was over about the late 40s. Ugh. All right, so If you ever build a time machine, don't go back to communist Russia, okay? Hey, y'all ready to move on to the next one?
Yeah.
All right, because they will not make you happy.
That's in the blue question, right? For sure.
Yeah, it's all there. Well, don't ignore it though. All right. Hey, here's another picture. What do we see here? Who's that guy?
Sam's Uncle Sam.
Uncle Sam. There we go.
Uncle Sam.
What's he looking at?
Uncle Sam.
Looking at Atlantic Ocean.
In Europe.
Yeah, Europe is on fire. And there he is. Uncle Sam's supposed to represent the United States, you know. Yeah, ain't what it used to be. Because remember, that's the whole case for isolationism, especially back in America's founding, was like the normal thing for Europeans is Europeans to kill Europeans. They're like always at war throughout history. So Americans are like, well, let's try to stick out of that.
Wait. You see how Europe is covered in black?
Yeah.
There's also black all over the USA. So it doesn't look
Over there.
Europe.
That I don't know. I mean, I don't think so. I think that's just how it kind of came out. But I think it's the clouds that, or the smoke really is the thing we're supposed to look for. You could be right. The thing is, there wasn't anything going on over there. I don't know. All right, so this is an overview. You don't have to write this down. All right, so what's this little unit about? Henry and Kayla? It is during this time the U.S. pulled itself out of isolationist policy that had guided it since the presidency of George Washington. This involvement into world events began with the Spanish-American War, and then we're going to see more development of it in World War I. One thing to keep in mind, every time America is in a major war or we face a major crisis, we don't come out the other end the same. Things change. As far as our government, our rules, and things like that, there's going to be big change. And we're going to see that World War I and the Spanish-American War. So the United States will expand its involvement into places such as Guam, Hawaii, the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and much more. Yeah, bye-bye. Go ahead. The U.S. also became intensely involved with Latin American affairs and constructed the Panama Canal, linking the Pacific and the Atlantic Oceans. So, I mean, they were linked. I mean, if you sail all the way around South America, you couldn't sail around north because there's ice, right? So, but it'll be useful. Hey, what's this? It's shipwreck, yeah.
With an American flag.
American flag on it. Yeah, this is one of our naval vessels. I think the USS Maine. I could be wrong. It blew up, and because of the explosion, people thought that it was attacked. A lot of historians, however, now think that it just blew up on its own because a lot of steam-powered vessels, like steamboats going up and down the Mississippi, I think like they blew up all the time. So people will do gambling on them, vacations, but there's stories just full of the things just blowing up because they weren't very well put together. A lot of pressure in there with all that steam. And so they think that might be what happened here, might not be. We'll talk about that in a second. So what led us out of isolationism? So what broke us out of that bubble and started making us spill out all over the rest of the world? With reforms of the Progressive Era, many Americans began to desire reforming other nations as well, especially nations that were seen as third world nations or not quite as developed as America. They're like, hey, we've got some good stuff going on here. Let's bring it out there. So it had a bit to do with that missionary spirit that I told you about, that the progressives saw it as kind of like a duty to spread not just things like Christianity, but also spread like the ideas of America, of capitalism, stuff like that. So what they're doing. This guy here, President McKinley, became the 25th president in 1897, and he's going to run on the promise of bringing progressive changes to America, like workers' rights and stuff like that. He's not really going to do that much, but he's going to run on it. And so the message is starting to get bigger. So he's going towards that middle class vote, I guess you could call it. During his presidency, Cuba, at this time a Spanish colony, was fighting a war for its independence. So if you remember way back from like your 8th grade U.S. history, Spain used to control all of Latin America, and even Florida and Texas and places like that for a while. Cuba is going to be one of its last pieces in that part of the world that it's going to hold on to. The Spanish government is not the same when it used to be. It's no longer the great big Holy Roman Empire. Its economy is actually going to be really devastated from all the gold and silver it's going to bring in from the New World. It's going to ruin its own economy because it's going to have too much gold. And so, but it's only going to be enhanced to rich people. Poor people are only going to get super poor because of it. And then after the French Revolution, Napoleon's going to take over Spain, totally embarrass the country, and it's not going to be able to pull itself up that well. At this time, really holding on to territory outside of Spain was costing it money. So many Americans, however, are going to support Cuba's fight for independence because they're going to see it as kind of like a brotherhood for our own fight for independence. They'll be like, hey, look, we overthrew a foreign monarchy. Now Cuba's overthrowing a foreign monarchy. We're cool. Let's help them out with that. So you had people who were just reading newspapers and magazines that were talking about all of these things that were going on in the Cuban War for Independence. And so, like, a lot of these stories were sensationalist, right? So they were talking about the Spanish soldiers doing terrible things to, like, Cuban girls and murders and all these other things. And yet bad things happen. But, like I said, a lot of this stuff was clickbait. So they kind of made it sound worse than it was to try to get people to buy newspapers. So a lot of Americans really wanted to get involved with this war. And we will. Hey, does anybody recognize there's a guy here?
Teddy Roosevelt.
Yeah, there he is again. Yeah. Yeah, he's going to keep popping up. Don't worry. Yeah, Teddy Roosevelt, he's kind of like a weird guy because, like,
So we really have a post for
Pablo Escobar.
why?
I want to know about
Maybe we can talk about it. Like, if we get past the Cold War and we start talking about like the war on drugs or something like that, we can talk about it. But like, we're not close to that. Yes.
I got a series really covering about Pablo Escobar in it.
You also watch a serial killer
Years ago, and I love it. The bloody alphabet. I love it so much.
Amazon suggested that to me, and I was like, no. So no, I'm sorry. I mean, enjoy your coloring, but no, we're not gonna. I mean, we might talk about Pablo Escobar later. I don't know. But so yeah, like Teddy Roosevelt, he's going to be a big figure in this war. He grew up as a rich guy in New York. He's kind of like a sickly kid, but his dad's going to buy him some exercise equipment, take him to the boxing gym. He's going to whip himself in shape. He's going to become very well educated. He's going to spend a lot of his youth teaching Bible school. He's eventually, I think, going to become governor of New York. And then he's going to become Secretary of the Navy. So that's the top guy in the Navy. He's going to relinquish that position, and he's going to get permission from the president to start a special military unit called the Rough Riders. And he's going to go to Texas and Oklahoma and recruit cowboys and Indians to be part of his Rough Riders. And he's going to bring them to Cuba. So we'll see about that.
How long ago was that?
1898. Yeah. So, as Americans read about the war for Cuban independence, they were further enraged by the Delome letter in which the Spanish ambassador mocked McKinley. So this was a telegraph that was intercepted. So somebody was listening in on the beep, 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 beeps, and they figured out that this guy from Spain, he was telling the president, oh, yes, we want peace and all this other stuff. But when they found the letter out, it was calling like McKinley an idiot, saying that Americans were cowards and all this other stuff. And so people got really mad about that. Nations didn't insult other nations like willy-nilly like that. There's a little bit more manners. In 1898, the USS Maine, the picture of that sunken boat I showed you, is going to explode off of the harbor of Havana. That's in Cuba. So Americans could be really mad. They're getting insulted by Spaniards. They're reading about the Spanish doing horrible things to Cubans. And then one of our boats blows up and a bunch of our sailors died. So yellow journalist is another term for muckraker, somebody who writes articles that might not be true, portray the explosion as an act of war by Spain. So we now know it was probably an accident, but we're immediately going to declare war on Spain. Congress is going to make the formal constitutional declaration of war. The president will sign off on it. We were expecting to go to war with Spain. So we sent our Navy off of California to the Philippines. And so they immediately got the wire. They attacked the Philippines, freeing it from Spain. At the same time, the U.S. will invade Cuba. So we got the war going this way. As people like Theodore Roosevelt, like I said, ex-Secretary of Navy, led his Rough Riders to victory in places like San Juan Hill. So it's going to be a very short war, only a matter of days. And most of the casualties on the U.S. side is actually going to be from diseases like malaria from mosquitoes or dysentery, where you drink dirty water and you die of diarrhea, stuff like that. So
You can die?
it's leading cause of death in the world.
What?
Dysentery, yeah.
You know where I learned about dysentery?
Having it.
Teen Titans Go.
All right. So you learned it from a cartoon. Yeah, it's you die of. Don't you remember that video we watched with the guy telling people don't drink potty water in England?
Oh, yeah.
Jon Snow, yeah. Yeah, it's still a big problem in places like Africa, parts of Asia, South America, places like that. People drink dirty water. They die of dehydration because of diarrhea. I mean, it's a major killer. Yeah, pretty big deal, Pickle. Hey, we're going to do one more slide today. Then we're going to call it quits, and we're good for the day. No. But yeah, I want us to move along a little quickly today and tomorrow to catch up with the other kids. Trying to have you all on the same page. Yeah?
Did they attack the Philippines? So instead of attacking Africa, they attacked the colonies?
Yeah, they attacked. Hey, guys and gals. Hey, we didn't. I don't think we. Well, the thing is, this was supposed to be a war of liberation, and so we were seeing ourselves as helping out third world countries that were being oppressed, right? So we were trying to kick out the oppressors. To go all the way to attack a country like Spain would have been very hard, and it would have been harder to justify to like Europeans. And we had something called, if you remember, the Monroe Doctrine, and that was America had this oath that or a policy, I guess you'd say, to keep foreign powers out of our hemisphere. So it was like nobody should run Brazil or Ecuador or something like that, except for Brazilians and Ecuadorians. So yeah, we were seeing ourselves as liberators. You had to justify a war, otherwise you can have the whole world come up on you. Yeah. All right, kids, we're about to do our last one for the day. I don't remember if I shared them yet, but I'm going to get some Quizlet sets for y'all to study over for your test. So that'll help you out a bit. Let's go ahead and go to the next one. I haven't used them in a while, though, for this class. Hey, another picture. What's here?
Uncle Sam
Uh-huh.
carrying a bunch of stuff.
A bunch of stuff. A whole bunch of stuff. Yeah, a bunch of stuff. So, yeah, look. Hey, what's this book say?
Education.
Religion, yeah. And here we got steel, stuff like that. Who's this guy here?
Is it India?
It's a Chinese man.
Yeah, Chinese guy. Yeah. So, so here's what this is portraying, right? China, for the longest time, it had been its own kingdom with its own emperor, and they really controlled and restricted. Hey, Kayla. Hey, really controlled and restricted who could trade in their country. They tried to keep foreigners out as much as possible. Eventually, though, you're going to have countries like Great Britain are going to they're going to beat them up in what's called the Opium Wars, and they're going to make them open their borders to trade as much as they want. Other countries are going to come in too, and you're going to see parts of China are going to be taken over by different countries such as Russia, Japan, and stuff like that, and of course England. Americans and the rest of the developed world is going to see China as a place with a lot of money, Henry, to buy a lot of manufactured things. So there's a lot of wealth there. But also, people are wanting to spread American ideas and Christianity down there. So there's hoping for the idea of profit and, again, that missionary spirit. So following the war, which we won pretty quickly, in 1898, Hawaii was annexed by the U.S., while Guam, the Philippines, and Puerto Rico were ceded by Spain. That means Spain gave them up. Some Samoan islands were annexed as well in 1899. The other ones were kept by Germany because they had them. So at the end of this war, America gained protectorship of these areas. So the Philippines, Puerto Rico, Hawaii, these were seen as important to us because we like to keep our naval bases at a lot of them to try to keep the U.S. safe, but also as refueling points. Because what's in between China and the United States?
A long ocean.
A long ocean. In the middle of that ocean is Hawaii. So you could have our boats go to Hawaii, refuel, get supplies, and then go all the way to China and go back. So they thought that's pretty smart then. In fact, we're going to build a big naval harbor there called Pearl Harbor. Wink, wink. You never heard of that. So these islands were seen as important refueling stations for the U.S. Navy, as many wished to expand our influence and protect trade influence. This expansion was strongly accelerated by this book. You don't have to write that down. By Alfred Thayer Mahan, called The Influence of Sea Power in History. And he made the argument that other countries like England and Athens and places like that, they were able to get really powerful because they had powerful navies. Powerful navies let you trade, keep your ocean safe so that you don't have pirates and stuff like that. And, you know, pirates are bad. Nobody likes that. It's going to be very popular in the U.S. In fact, Teddy Roosevelt's really going to like it. So Teddy Roosevelt is going to become a public hero in the Spanish-American War, and people are going to be calling for him to become the president. His party, the Republican Party, however, was like, whoa, this guy's crazy. He's got radical ideas, and we don't want him becoming the president because then he's going to bump up against the establishment.
Wait, what was radical about?
Well, he was calling for a lot of things like stomping down monopolies and stuff like that, right? And he was also calling to help out with worker rights and consumer rights and stuff like that. And they were like, but you're going to shake the vote doing that. So what they decided to do, McKinley needed to be reelected president. They put Teddy Roosevelt in as his vice presidential pick, because back then, if you became vice president, you basically just hosted dinners and visited libraries, and then you had to retire afterwards. So that was a way to kind of get rid of him. So that's going to be our last one for today. And we're going to see how Vice President Teddy Roosevelt will become actual President Teddy Roosevelt tomorrow. Tomorrow's a B-Day. Yeah, if you're virtual, it's a B-Day tomorrow. I put the schedule up on the bottom of our Google Classroom, so make sure you keep up with that. All right, but in any case, we're going to end the lecture for today. Thank you for your time. It's been about 45 minutes, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.